an experience that Peter goes through that helps the Simon become Peter. And so along the way, we've talked about how Simon was called on that boat in Luke chapter 5. And that in John 6, that the disciples were challenged that we would be fused with Jesus, that we would eat of his blood and eat of his flesh and drink of his blood. And that Simon was named Peter in Matthew chapter 16, that would call him to the work of growing this kingdom, where Jesus said that the gates of Hades will not overpower my church, and Simon's part in that. But we did look in Luke chapter 22, a pretty challenging text, where Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. And it's interesting how Jesus uses Simon's name in a double way, sort of that rabbinic formula of truly, truly, only it says Simon, Simon, really emphasizing that this message that and encouragement that he gives Peter is going to be significant. In John chapter 13, Jesus in John chapter 13 is going to wash the disciples' feet, and in that particular case, Peter has trouble. He thinks that Jesus shouldn't wash his feet. But in doing so, Jesus says, you don't understand what I've done to you, but what I've done to you is an example for you to do for others. And now in John chapter 20, it's an opportunity to notice how Simon is going to grow in his focus. In John chapter 20, Jesus has been crucified and his body's been placed in the tomb. It's been a long 3 days of darkness, of confusion, and of pain as the disciples wondered what would happen. Simon is referenced now in the 20th chapter, and you'll notice he's called both Simon Peter in verse 2 and Peter in verse 3 and following. But as Peter hears about the women's report about how the tomb is empty this first day of the week, this 3 days after the crucifixion, then there seems to be an opportunity in verse 6 as Peter and John raced to the tomb. And John gets there first, being the faster runner and is probably significantly older, maybe the youngest disciple of all. And given John's personality in verse 5, John stops and looks in the tomb, and he takes careful note of the arrangement of the grave cloths, the face cloth. He's the only gospel writer that includes those details. Of course, just flip over, turn the page to chapter 21, and when John tells us about how the disciples caught fish, a netful reminiscent of Simon's calling way back at the very beginning in Luke chapter 5 when Simon found himself up to Jesus' knees in fish at the bottom of that fishing boat. It is interesting that Peter is in such a hurry to see the Lord that he throws on his cloak, jumps in the water and swims. He can't wait for the boat to get to the shore. And then when they get there, the disciples drag the fish on shore, and while everyone else seems to be crowding around Jesus in verse 8, Simon is going to tell you that the boat is full of fish, and while they get to the fire and Jesus has fish on it, and he says, bring some of the fish you've caught, that in verse 11, John's going to tell you there's 153 fish in the net. Who else would count the fish? I would have just said the net was full, and that would have been good enough. But can you imagine? You've got squirming, flopping fish, and there's one disciple over there by himself going 1, 2, 3, 4. John has issues, or at least that's the personality that God has gifted him with to notice details. So back in John chapter 20, then it certainly doesn't surprise us that John notices the details in the tomb. He's the one when Jesus feeds the multitude, he'll comment about how there was a lot of green grass there. That's John. But as John is noticing that, Peter catches up, huffing and puffing in verse 8, and unlike John, who's all about detail and observation and careful notation, Peter's a guy that says, if it's you, tell me to come on the water, and he jumps out of the boat and tries to walk on water. He's a guy that just barrels right in. So in verse 8, so the other disciple who had first come to the tomb then also entered. He saw and believed. So while Peter rolls into the tomb in verse 6 and notices the things that John details, it's interesting how John describes that he himself in verse 8 saw and believed. But that's said apparently uniquely to John. It doesn't seem to include both of them. And then he tells us in verse 9, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. Now Jesus has been telling them numerous times that this is exactly what must happen, but not only are they slow to understand that it has happened, but they seem also to be slow to understand why it's happened and the purpose that the crucifixion has. Peter seems to still be struggling with a lack of focus. Now, John, when he sees the tomb, it clicks. He sees something, but Peter doesn't have that focus, not yet. So now let's look ahead to chapter 21. As we get there, the disciples have been in the upper room and behind locked doors because of fear, and Jesus appears to them, tells them to not be afraid. Thomas misses that, and then Jesus appears a second time, tells Thomas to come and look at his hands and the wound in his side, and so on. What's interesting about spiritual development is when we read through our Bibles, we read about these incredible moments where the Red Sea is parted, or Abraham offers Isaac on the altar. They follow Jesus. He raises people from the dead. They see him resurrected. What we sometimes forget, we read kind of from high point to high point to high point, and we forget sometimes there's a lot of life that's lived between those clear moments when God really makes his will evident to us, when an open door is really obvious, when maybe a closed door is really obvious, that a lot of time of life can be lived in the hallway between one door and the other. And so after Jesus has been seen and all of the incredible excitement, time passes. And Peter is not one to hang around or to just be content in waiting. And so he says to some of the disciples in verse 3, I'm going fishing. It seems that Peter is a man of action, and inactivity is not something he can tolerate very well. I'm going fishing, and there's some who say, we'll go with you. And so they get in the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Likely, they're out of practice, but two, they're probably distracted. They're processing and thinking about all the things that's gone on, but they haven't caught anything. Which kind of rings a little bell way back to Luke chapter 5. That's kind of where they were when Jesus got in Simon's boat that very first time and told him to put out his nets into the deep. And Simon has to say, we've been up all night and we've caught nothing, but if you insist, we will. Verse 4, but when the day was now breaking, been a long night of activity, but fruitless activity, fishless activity. And now here at the very early part of the day, as light is just beginning to fill the scene, Jesus stood on the beach, and yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. It could be that Jesus has modified his appearance or withheld their ability to see, but it's also true that he's at a distance, and it's not hardly light at all, so we're talking shadows and outlines, and again, they don't expect to see him. It doesn't seem to be Jesus' intent to be recognized even in his voice, because when he speaks, they don't necessarily recognize him either. Verse 5, so Jesus said to them, children, do you not have any fish? Do you? And they said, no. And then verse 6 would have been so much fun. Every time you take a little boy fishing in a boat and they catch a fish, you always have to hand them your pocket knife and say, make sure you mark the spot on that boat where you caught him so you can catch one next time, as if the spot on the boat is what matters. Kind of in a similar way, Jesus says in verse 6, cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat and you will find a catch. Strange, possibly quite silly, but much like it all started, Jesus asked them to do something that they got to make a decision whether they will or not. And I've always wondered what happens. Obviously, when they see the net full of fish, they recognize it's Jesus. But I wonder if in the beginning here, is this an inkling? Is this hopeful? is it just an old fishing joke? And they're like, why not? We got nothing else to do. They're just really killing time anyway. But you just sort of wonder if the smile just starts to spread across maybe some of their faces or the raised eyebrow as they look at each other. So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, who already saw and believed, we know in chapter 20 and verse 8, but apparently Peter has not yet gotten to the same point. Therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, because he had taken it off, and jumped into the sea and swam. In fact, it says, threw himself into the sea. Boy, you talk about enthusiasm and excitement. But the other disciples came in the little boat. They're not far from land, but about 100 yards away, and they dragged the net full of fish. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. We talked about that passage in the sifting. In spite of his promises, he failed Jesus, didn't do what he claimed that he would be able to do, and then went out into the night and wept bitterly after that experience. But he's seen Jesus in the upper room. But as far as we can tell, there's been no conversation between Jesus and Peter. When there was a personal one about his failure, it's to Peter specifically that Jesus said, Satan's demanding permission to sift you like wheat, and I've prayed for you that your faith would not fail, and when you turn again, strengthen your brothers. It was to Peter that they had that conversation, and there doesn't seem to be a record of any such type personal conversation after the resurrection. So is there likely then in Peter this residual, more than residual, apparent guilt and struggling and you know, he really failed, so he really can't, maybe he shouldn't be a part of the group, or maybe he's not worthy. The kinds of normal things that we feel when we fail, especially when we make such grand claims and then fail. So Peter gets there, verse 9. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid and fish placed upon it and bread. And Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." And so Simon Peter's the one who gets up and grabs the net and drags it up. And then, of course, John notes how many fish and that the fish, or the net rather, is not torn. Then in verse 12, come and have breakfast. And none of the disciples venture to question him, "Who are you?" because they know it's him. This is not the first time now. They've seen him since the resurrection. And then Jesus in verse 13 came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. A breaking of the loaves and the fish. This will be the third time that Jesus has fed a multitude, only this is the smallest multitude of the 3. It's certainly not the first time that they have shared a meal with him, and so I can imagine the smiles. This takes time to give them a little of the fish and give them a little of the bread, and just imagine the looks and the connections, and nobody's saying anything, maybe because they're overwhelmed with a million questions. What's it like? Where you been? How's this work? I mean, wow. Or they also know that he has been appearing and then leaving, that he's not staying with them anymore like he did prior to his resurrection. Maybe it's that reticence or reluctance to say anything because you don't want to kill the moment. You don't want to say the wrong thing, and maybe somehow that's why Jesus won't stay, or why he will go on and go somewhere else. John mentions these details. In fact, it says in verse 14, now this is the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. John tells us how many fish are in the net. He tells us about how the net doesn't even break. And then interestingly enough, in verse 9, he says that when they get out on the land, they see a charcoal fire already laid there. A charcoal fire. A charcoal fire would be the result of it having been there a while, the coals or the embers. But it's interesting that John would bother to give such a detail. Now, not every translation gives you this detail. Some just simply say fire. But John did say a charcoal fire. He did specify what kind of fire, and you miss a little tiny nugget if the translation that you might read from just kind of glosses over that and says fire. Because why would John bother with it's a charcoal fire? Other than, he's going to count the fish anyway, so why not note that? But this whole thing, this whole experience from the disciples fishing all night and catching nothing, and this strange request about casting nets on the other side, all this is very reminiscent, very much a reminder of the experience they'd had with Jesus and really how it all began. And then what's coming in verse 15 is that conversation. Now, Jesus had talked with Peter specifically about his sifting and about how when he turned again that he would strengthen his brothers, and then it sort of hung there, perhaps over Peter, not necessarily unresolved, but maybe not fully processed, certainly not between them. And then what follows in verse 15 is going to be that very conversation. But as John sets the scene for us, he's telling us about Peter. That's how this gospel is going to end, is the commission that Jesus gives to Peter. So is there any significance to the charcoal fire mentioned and discussed in verse 9? Well, have we heard of that? Have we read this before, this detail? Well, flip back to John chapter 18. Actually, we have read about a charcoal fire before, and perhaps that's John's intent, is to draw a connection between the two contexts. Peter had loudly perhaps and proudly perhaps proclaimed that though others would fail, that he would not, and Jesus tells him that you're gonna deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. But at the end of that pronouncement in John chapter 13, the very next thing that Jesus says to Peter is John chapter 14, verse 1, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. It's about believing in God and about believing in God's purpose in Christ. So just trying to focus our thoughts here a little bit. In John, just stay if you'd like in John 18. Let me remind you that it was in John 20, verse 8, when John sees the empty tomb, that he sees and believes. And what Jesus told Peter in John 14, verse 1, after saying, you'll deny me, is, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. So John does when he sees the empty tomb in John 20. But Peter doesn't seem to have gotten there quite yet. Perhaps it's that reluctance or that distance or that doubt that is in his heart because he has failed the Lord so miserably in spite of his promises. So in John chapter 18, John records when Peter denies Jesus, as after Jesus is arrested in the garden at the first of the chapter. Simon Peter, in verse 10, oddly enough, draws the sword to cut off not just, I don't think he was intending for an ear, I think he was intending for more, but that's as close as he got. But John calls him Simon Peter, the one drawing the sword. That's the man, perhaps it's in transition, that this drawing of the sword is a lesson, because when Jesus says, put up the sword, that's when Peter departs. That's when he begins to struggle. It's when the lesson begins, the sifting intensifies. Verse 15 of John 18, John says that Simon Peter was following Jesus. Now he calls him Peter in the context, like verse 11, right after calling him Simon Peter, calls him Peter again in verse 16, right after calling him Simon Peter. So why bother with Simon Peter? Just stick with Peter. Perhaps verse 15 is a signal. Simon Peter was following Jesus. If Simon Peter is the man in transition, the disciple Simon becoming Peter, then Simon is literally following Jesus in verse 15. He's following Jesus. At a distance, sort of in no man's land, he hasn't left Jesus, but he's not standing next to him either. But he is following him, and we can relate with that. And then John says, Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple is known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold. And they were warming themselves, and Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. The first time that Peter denies that he is a disciple of Jesus while he's following Jesus is while he's rubbing his hands and holding his hands out to the heat of a charcoal fire. Our minds are wired in a way, I'm told there's actually quite an amazing chemical process that happens in our brain in terms of memory when we are really excited or really frightened. That there's actually a biochemical electrical process that goes on that's different, that causes us to record memories of either high excitement or high terror in vivid detail. That we remember things in sharp, clear kinds of images, and that we associate powerful memories with images. This is why a smell can trigger things. I remember walking down a hallway in college, talking to my roommate about who knows what, certainly not some class we had just had, and just stopped in my tracks, and my roommate said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Somebody's building a sailboat." And of course, this is Lubbock, Texas, in the men's dormitory of Lubbock Christian University. So my roommate said, "What?" I said, "Somebody's building a sailboat." And I knocked on the door of a room I didn't know the guys inside, and the guy opened the door, and he was using the exact same strange two-part glue. One was a dark brown liquid, not quite as dark as molasses, but similar, and then a brownish beige powder, and you mix the powder and that resin, and it makes a waterproof glue for wood products, and he was doing some sort of wood thing. But it took my mind in an instant flash, in absolute clarity, vivid clarity, to being a young man in Idaho while living on the dairy when my dad was building a sailboat out of plywood. He was using the same glue. I hadn't thought about that, had no reason to, for years and years and years and years, and that smell triggered a flash so that I said something ludicrous. Who's building a sailboat? I didn't say who's using wood glue, because I instantly could see the sailboat. Sounds, colors, the smell of fall on the breeze, the rattling of leaves in the breeze, the sighing of pine trees in movement, all kinds of strange things can get codified or painted in to a memory and cause these powerful, vivid triggers. Peter's worst failure, when the third time, when he denies Jesus, he's going to go out in the night and weep bitterly. That when he says, "I don't know Jesus," that a rooster begins to crow. Luke says that Jesus looks across the courtyard at him, and so it's this incredibly visceral experience, and it all started over a charcoal fire. Fire would have been enough, but a particular kind of fire. See, not just a glue, but a wood glue, not just a wood glue, but that wood glue, a charcoal fire. And so do you suppose that Jesus just accidentally decided in John chapter 21 that when he would appear to the disciples, he would give them he found Peter and the disciples fishing. Why are they fishing? Yeah, they're needing something to do, but what happens if they stay fishing too long? What happens if they're like, man, I don't know, I don't get it, I'm just going to fish. You know what, I miss the simplicity of just fishing. I think I'll just be fishing. There's a risk here of Peter leaving his calling. Remember, Jesus told him the first fish story of Luke chapter 5, do not be afraid, from now on you be fishers of men. Apparently, Peter potentially is at risk for for leaving fishing for men and going back to just fishing for fish. So Peter's not doing anything wrong in fishing, but it's going to become wrong if he fishes too long. What is a healthy break? What is a sabbatical? What is a R&R trip, rest and relaxation, can become a distraction, can become a new obsession or a new focus. And so Jesus, aware that they're fishing, shows up at the fishing hole and purposely gives them a similar experience, throw your nets on the other side, and begins to draw connections, allow them to draw connections of experience. It's the nets full of fish that it's the Lord, because they've been down this road before. They've been in this boat before. And then when Peter comes to the shoreline, there's Jesus, and he feeds them like he does and has, whether you're talking about the great multitudes or just daily living with Jesus. And he does it over a charcoal fire. Not all the disciples would have even noticed. It wouldn't have been significant, but it would be to John. He was there, and it definitely would have been to Peter. So you can imagine, while Jesus is feeding them, he just says in verse 12, come and have breakfast. I don't know if there was breakfast chatter. I do know that nobody's questioning him, so they're not pursuing anything of depth or anything that is challenging. But wouldn't it have been comforting to just share a meal? I don't know where Peter is, but I picture him sitting there, squatting by the fire, eating the fish and looking down at his hands, holding a piece of bread and a piece of fish, and just staring into the fire. We do that. We'll do that with moving water, and we'll do that with fire. We like to gather around a fire and stare into it. And just with the charcoal fire, wouldn't he have had the flash of memory? And in this case, it's not the positive one of a positive childhood memory, but his worst failure. Such a flash, wouldn't that have drawn Peter into quietness, into internal solitude or isolation? Could you imagine Peter just staring at the fire and staring at his hands, staring at the fish and the loaves, and just all of that rolling over him? It's been 3 years now that he's been a disciple of Jesus. He's given up his profession as a fisherman to follow Jesus, and what did all that mean, and what has it amounted to, and here he is, and what comes next? What comes next? In Luke chapter 22, Jesus specifically addressed Peter about the sifting. And what John is going to share with us uniquely, he's the only gospel writer that does, is he shares with us a unique conversation where after they finish breakfast, and the whole time that Peter's over there eating and looking into a charcoal fire, Jesus is looking at Peter, that Jesus has words just for Peter. That there's a conversation just for Peter. It's a conversation about focus. It's a conversation about purpose. So I would encourage you, in preparation for our next study, to read this short conversation between Peter and Jesus in verse 15 of John 21 through verse 17. And notice carefully the words. Look at the words Simon Peter, and when each of his different names are used, because all three are in this little short conversation. He's called Simon Peter, he's called Simon, and he's called Peter, all three. in this brief little paragraph. Maybe contemplate on why which word where. If your Bible uses any notations, any little numbers, any little letters by words, notice those. This is one of those cases where they'll be very helpful. And we'll consider even more about how we can focus in our walk with Christ as we follow Peter's example, as we follow Jesus walking the path of peace.